Does Insta360 finally have a competitor? The Qoocam 3 is here in late 2023, nearly 4 years after Kandao's last camera, the Qoocam 8K, which was a camera that had a lot of potential but also a lot of problems that were later flagged by users, such as overheating, swollen batteries, and lenses that would go out of focus when the camera got hot. But now time has passed, and Kandao have had a chance to learn some important lessons. But have they? In this video, I'll give my full unbiased review of the Qoocam 3. Most of the reviews I've watched up until now have left out some major red flags that you need to know about. And despite not being sent the camera because I'm in Kandao's bad books, I'm going to do my best to make this review as unbiased as possible. Stay to the end though if you do want to hear my biased review. Now the first pro and one of the biggest talking points of the Qoocam 3 is the price. It's $349 US, and this makes it one of the cheapest, if not the cheapest 360 camera released in the past few years. They've completely redesigned the camera body from scratch, and it shares nothing with the previous Qoocam 8K, which is kind of strange that they're still keeping the Qoocam name, but whatevs. What it is similar to though is the GoPro Max from 2019. Look at that. The camera designs are practically identical, with the offset lenses and horizontal screen on the front. The side compartments work in an identical way. Inside, you'll find a nearly identical layout, with the battery in the middle, USB-C port at the end, and SD card slot on the side, logo on the other side, and rubber recording button on the top. Are they allowed to do that? This is such an obvious copy of the GoPro Max. The Qoocam is bigger and heavier than the GoPro Max, however. I do find it kind of ironic that they do this, because when they released the 8K, their marketing message around that was beyond the Max, implying that the camera is better than the GoPro Max, yet all these years later, they've just gone ahead and copied the GoPro Max. Just like the Max, it also records spatial audio from having microphones on every side of the camera, and this is definitely an upside, especially for those who record 360 videos for VR. When you turn the camera on, the interface is pretty similar to other cameras and is easy to pick up. You can play your footage back in 360, which is a nice touch that other cameras also have as well. I have to say, I'm not the biggest fan of the horizontal screen because it's so easy to tap the wrong thing, especially when you're swiping left and right. So you need to be really precise with your finger movements when operating the touchscreen. Whereas with the vertical screen of the X3, it's much harder to make a mistake because left and right swiping is much easier on a vertical screen. And here are the screens side by side. The X3's is nearly twice the size. The Qoocam also has 2 touch buttons built into the side, which allow you to change the viewpoint or set a shortcut. Here it's set to lock screen. Overall, the design is okay. It's not the best I've seen, and it's also not the worst. It's somewhere in the middle. Now you're probably wondering what the battery life is like. Well, this is the battery here. It's a small 1600 milliamp battery, which is on the small side. From it, I seem to be getting between 1 and 2 hours use if you're using it on and off, but mostly on throughout that time. I've also noticed sometimes you can charge this camera for hours and then you start shooting with it and it says the battery's empty. I don't know if it's because it needs a certain kind of USB-C cable or if there's another reason, but I have found the charging to be inconsistent. The next question you're probably wondering is, does it overheat? Well, that was one of the biggest issues of the Qoocam 8K. It would overheat and the lenses would go out of focus. So have they repeated the exact same problem with the 3? Yep. When I first started using this camera, I got about 5 minutes of footage before the camera said it was too hot to continue. Literally just 5 minutes. It was like 3 1-minute shots. At that point, I thought, I can't continue with this review if the camera isn't going to work for more than 5 minutes. Then I dug into the menu a bit and found that you can change the auto stop temperature to be really hot instead of standard, which then meant I could keep recording past that point. It's just weird though, because the camera wasn't that hot when the message came up. When you change it though, you will get quite a bit more shooting time out of the Qoocam. I put it side by side with the One RS 1-inch and X3 on one of Sydney's hottest days in recent memory. It was about 34 degrees here in early spring. That's global warming for you, but it was the perfect chance to test this. So I put all cameras in full sun recording 5.7K resolution. And after changing the setting on the Qoocam, I was able to get to 20 minutes without issue, which made me think, oh, okay, maybe it doesn't overheat. So I stopped the recording and I had to move on with some other tests. But then I pressed record again to do something different and the message came up just on the Qoocam and not the other 2 cameras. So if you're shooting in hot weather, even if you change the overheating overheating setting, it still will stop you from recording if the camera gets too hot. And when I put my fingers on each of the 3 camera bodies, by far the One RS 1" was the hottest due to the metal body. Then the X3 and the Qoocam 3 were warm, but I wouldn't say super hot. Like I could have left my hand there for a minute if I had to. So they weren't at the point that they felt like they were going to overheat, but still the Qoocam stopped me from recording until I went into the shade and turned the camera off and let it cool down for about 10 minutes before I could start again. This is a red flag, especially if you live in a warm climate where the temperatures get up to 30 degrees Celsius and beyond. Now, I'm not saying that Insta360 cameras don't overheat, because they do, but what I am saying is that the Qoocam struggles with hot weather a lot more, whereas the Insta360 cameras tend to overheat with long recordings of 45 minutes plus. I've seen mixed results from others regarding the overheating. My friend 360 Rumors did a test and he was able to record for like 17 hours straight with the camera plugged into power and it didn't overheat, and that's a great result. However, that was one test and I'm assuming it probably wasn't that hot in the conditions he was recording in. So if you want to record for a long time and it's not too hot where you're filming, then the Qoocam could potentially do it, but just don't rely on it. Now let's talk about the specs. It has a 1/1.55 inch sensor, which is a better sensor than the X3, which means it is hypothetically capable of better photo and video quality, keyword being hypothetically. It has an f1.6 aperture, which is the widest aperture on any 360 camera ever. For resolutions, it shoots 5.7K 30 and 4K 30 and 60, which are the exact same specs that we've had with other cameras for the past 4 years. Even Kandao's previous camera, the 8K, had higher specs than that. But you know what? Maybe that was a good thing that they reduced the specs to make it more manageable so the camera didn't overheat. Oh wait. It shoots 62 megapixel photos. You'll see later though that this isn't quite what it seems. So if you look at the spec sheet, the only thing really that stands out are the aperture and the sensor size, which is good, but as with any spec sheet, numbers are just numbers. The results are what matters. So does it stack up for results? Here's a 5.7K video I shot at 30 FPS in auto exposure mode. The video seems really bright, the sun area is overexposed, and overall the white balance seems a bit on the blue side. Aside from that, it's pretty good in terms of general sharpness and quality. But look at those skies, they're pure white. This is when I thought, okay, now I need to take things into my own hands and set the exposure manually. So I set the settings that I thought should have worked in these lighting conditions, which were ISO 100 and shutter speed 1200. And how did that turn out? It's even more overexposed, which was pretty interesting. So in order to get that detail in the sky, I had no option but to change the manual settings to the absolute most extreme, which was ISO 100, shutter speed 1/6400. And this finally got the sun under control, albeit turning the shadows black in the process and adding a bit too much contrast than I otherwise would have liked. However, when I then entered the shady area of this park, as you would expect, everything becomes a silhouette and no detail is captured in those shadows. This got me thinking, what's going on here? Why do I have to go to the absolute extreme with these camera settings in order to get proper exposure? And then it hit me. I think it did anyway, I just like saying that. The reason it's so overexposed is because of the aperture. Normally having a wide aperture is a massive advantage with cameras because it means you can have a shallow depth of field and sometimes you can get even better or sharper video quality. But since the aperture is fixed on this really wide aperture, it means the camera is letting in so much light that you have to go to the opposite extreme to stop it from overexposing. Since you can't change the aperture, it's fixed on 1.6. With this shot here, I've got my lens set to f2.5 and that works well because I'm in low light. Whereas if I use these same settings outside, everything would be white. And that's kind of what's going on here. My suspicion is, and again, this is just a suspicion, a theory, but I think that f1.6 aperture is a downside for shooting during the day. And daytime shooting is like 90% of what the average person shoots, which kind of puzzles me. It's like they've made this camera for low light or not daytime, and they haven't even programmed it properly so the auto exposure can compensate for that wide aperture. Therefore, when using the Qoocam 3, you're going to have to shoot manually using extreme shutter speeds, especially when you're filming in broad daylight. And you don't always want to have to do that. Sometimes you just want to turn your camera on, press record, and that's it. I personally see this as a pretty big red flag and something that would only work for people that like spending the time to compose their shot and set every last camera setting every time you use the camera, which to me defeats the purpose of 360 cameras, which are supposed to be fun, quick, easy, intuitive. Anyway, maybe there's a silver lining with their stabilization. Here is what they call super steady stabilization. And wow, that is probably the worst stabilization I've seen in a 360 camera since 2018. In fact, I'd say it's borderline unusable, especially for any scenes with a lot of movement. Even with slower moving scenes, the horizon often appears as wavy. That's really not good. Putting it side by side with its two closest competitors, the Insta360 X3 and One RS 1-inch, and what I've done is tried to get the best results from each of them. With the Qoocam and One RS 1-inch, that's using manual exposure, and with the X3, that's using active HDR. Without any color correction, the Qoocam looks really blue and the other's a bit on the warm side. The One RS 1-inch is the sharpest for sure, and the Qoocam seems to be slightly sharper than the X3. Just bear in mind that active HDR prioritizes dynamic range over sharpness. The X3 keeps the sun under control the best, followed by the Qoocam 3, again using those extreme shutter speeds, followed by the One RS 1-inch, where I didn't push the shutter speed as far. In hindsight, I probably should have, but still I'll give it to the Qoocam because I'm feeling generous. Now I've color corrected all three cameras, and with this handheld shot, to me the Insta360 shots look far more vibrant and the colors look more accurate to how they look in real life, whereas the Qoocam seem pretty off. I also noticed a fair bit of color banding on my t-shirt with the Qoocam that isn't present with the other two cameras. In a low light scene here in my office, the One RS 1-inch by far delivers the best results of the three, and I would say that the Qoocam 3 comes in second. It does have noticeably less grain than the X3. However, it doesn't really touch the 1-inch. That sounded wrong. In terms of dynamic range around the 360 sign. So Qoocam is a decent option for low light. It will be better than the X3, since this does seem to be what they were aiming for with the f1.6 aperture and slightly bigger sensor than the X3. The 1-inch still dominates both cameras though, both during the day and at night. So is the Qoocam any better at photos? Well, credit where credit's due, yes it is. I'm actually fairly impressed with the quality you can get from the Qoocam 3 after you put in the time to edit the shots properly. I've always liked the color depth that Kandao cameras are capable of, and this camera is no exception. It has a mode that they call DNG8 that shoots 8 raw shots simultaneously, which when combined together reduce noise in the image significantly. So that's great. However, it's lacking an inbuilt HDR mode. While it does have AEB, auto exposure bracketing, this needs to be done manually in their desktop software and still doesn't deliver the results you would get with Insta360 and Ricoh cameras in terms of dynamic range. This DNG8 mode, however, only delivers resolution 1/4 of the advertised resolution of 62 megapixels. If you want 62, you need to shoot single shot DNG. However, I would just see no reason to do that when you can get better overall quality with DNG8. And weirdly, when you put them side by side, there's almost no difference in sharpness between 62 and 15.49. The reason is they've overinflated the megapixels, and this was also done with the X3. And I'm not going to pretend I fully understand this, but I believe it's 4 small pixels equals 1 big pixel, and the overall quality is exactly the same, it's just different numbers, which is why I never take the spec sheet on face value. Still though, these photos are decent. But how does it compare to its main competitors for 360 photos? I put it side by side again with the X3, the One RS 1-inch, and the Trisio Lite 2, which currently, in my opinion, is the best camera for virtual tours under $500. So I'm comparing cameras roughly in that price range with the 1-inch added just because. I've color corrected these shots, but not denoised or defringed. And zooming in close to the textures on my wall, and easily the Trisio Lite 2 performs the best for noise. It's done a really fantastic job here. Then I'd say the Qoocam 3 in DNG8 mode comes second, followed by the 1-inch, followed by X3. For sharpness, again, the Trisio wins. These plants are much sharper from the Trisio's perspective than they are the other three. Here's another sharpness comparison. Trisio comes first. I'd say the 1-inch is second, followed by Qoocam, followed by X3. And for dynamic dynamic range, I'd say probably the X3 comes first, followed by the 1-inch, followed by Trisio, and Qoocam bringing up the tail. Unfortunately, dynamic range is not a strength of the Qoocam right now, since it has limited bracketing options. So overall, my pick for a low budget virtual tour camera is still the Trisio Lite 2, followed by the 1-inch, followed by the Qoocam, then the X3. The camera does have other modes like time-lapse and some others, but I think those are a side thing to the main show, which is photo and video quality, and more importantly, workflow, the shooting and editing workflow. So let's talk about it. Starting with the mobile app, I actually don't mind the Qoocam 3 app at all, especially the shooting menu. It's got some nice options and it makes the camera pretty easy to use and preview your shots. You can see they've added their own version of the Insta360 Shot Lab, which is just a shameless copy, but at least it gives users more options of things they can do with their footage. And besides, Insta360 copies other companies in a lot of ways as well, so I'll forgive them for that. One downside of the mobile workflow is that you need to download your photos and videos before you can preview them, whereas with Insta360 cameras, you don't need to download, you get an instant preview straight away on your phone. Now, in terms of the desktop workflow, installing Kandao software as a Mac user is a painful process. While you can download it fine from their website, you're going to get error after error. You'll need to go into your system settings and manually allow this software to open the first few times, and it's just a really clunky process. I'm sure it's better on PC, I hope it is for my PC friends, but for Mac, not so much. Once you get past that though, the software works fine. It was decently built. It does the basics of what it needs to do. They have two separate softwares, Qoocam Studio and Kandao RAW Plus. So if you're shooting photos in the DNG 8 mode, you need to use RAW Plus to combine all the DNG photos together, then send it to Qoocam Studio to stitch them. For 360 videos, you import and stitch just in the Qoocam Studio app. I will say if you're shooting photos for virtual tours, this is an extra step that you'll need to take with every photo that is time consuming versus say Insta360 cameras where all the bracketing and merging and stitching is all done at once with one click of a button. In general, the desktop software is slow and so are the exporting times. So with my low light comparison from earlier, I exported the exact same 2-minute clip from the X3 and Qoocam using their respective desktop softwares. And for the X3 inside Insta360 Studio, it took 1 minute and 31 seconds to stitch and export this shot. With the Qoocam 3, it took 21 minutes and 12 seconds for the exact same clip with the same settings. That is literally nearly 20 times slower. So can you imagine if you shot an hour's worth of footage? That's going to take you literally up to 24 hours. This is 2023. We don't have a full day to wait for our footage to stitch. It's a major red flag. Also, I found the stitching isn't always right. Sometimes there are noticeable seam lines in both photos and videos, and while you can adjust the stitching manually in the software, you don't want to have to do this with every photo and video. And I found when I left it to the automatic stitching settings, there were some super obvious stitch lines in my shots. And as someone who might be a beginner to 360 cameras, you don't want to have to learn how to stitch your shots manually, you just want it to do it for you. Even as someone more experienced, I don't like having to manually go in and change the stitching. But Mr. Ben, they're working on the firmware and the software. There will be an update soon, they say. No. The time to update your firmware and your software is before you release a camera. It's not after. This exact same pattern has happened with the previous two Qoocam cameras. Where the camera was released, people said that it was missing features or it wasn't working properly, to which they responded, oh, we're working on the software and the firmware. And maybe they did with some things and not others, but still, it took them weeks, months, and years to fix all of the issues that should have been fixed before they launched the camera. So the whole idea of it will be updated is not a valid one. Any updates should be extra things beyond what the original camera should have had from day one. And it's clearly missing so many different software aspects to this overall shooting and editing workflow. Almost every issue I flagged in this video is not the hardware. The hardware's fine. In fact, I reckon if Insta360 took this hardware, they could make the camera amazing. The issue's in the software. It's not fully developed, the firmware needs improvements, the desktop app needs improvements, the mobile app could be better, and this is all the kind of stuff you want to see in the camera when you're spending your hard-earned money on it. You don't want to have to wait 6 or 12 months for it to do what you thought it should have done from day one. Unbiased. Unbiased, unbiased, unbiased. So like I said, I think this camera is actually perfectly fine as a camera, and hopefully, fingers crossed, they update it and they watch this video and they fix the issues with it to make it the camera that it is capable of being, because it could be an X3 competitor. It could be a serious contender in the 360 camera market. But right now, with all of these limitations, I don't see it. The Qoocam 3 is absolutely not a competitor to the Insta360 X3 in late 2023. It just doesn't have any unique selling points over the other cameras available right now. Literally every one of its strengths is done better by another camera. The main use case I see for the Qoocam 3 is the photos. It does decent photos, there's no denying, and at a price of $349, it could actually be an okay option for virtual tours, assuming it doesn't get any major issues that come out, like the thermal defocus issue or anything else that would hinder its photo ability. But from what I've seen so far, it looks like it should be an okay contender for virtual tours. If you're only shooting virtual tours, then I'd still recommend the Trisio over the Qoocam 3 right now, unless you also want a camera that can do video, albeit with all the workflow issues. And for 360 video, even though the camera is a good price, if this is your sole use case, just get an Insta360 camera. I hate to say it, I know they have a monopoly on the market, and no one wants a good quality Insta360 competitor more than I do. But no one has really stepped up, because Insta360 have kept improving out of sight and other companies are presenting outdated technology. So if you are shooting 360 video, I would encourage you to maybe go up another $100 and get the X3. But if your budget is $350 and that's it, consider going back to the One X2. Find one new or even used, because I think the reliability factor, the workflow, and general ease of use will still be better than the Qoocam 3. Kandao are a small to medium-sized company, therefore there's no guarantee that they are going to fix any of the issues that the camera currently has. However, you can probably expect some incremental firmware updates over the next year or so that address the basics. I don't think they're going to do too much, because software doesn't seem to be their strength. So there's also that element of risk that the camera's issues will never be fixed or improved. Strangely as well, Kandao have announced a Qoocam Ultra coming, I don't know when, maybe soon, which is supposed to be a better version of the Qoocam 3. Who knows if it actually will be. I really think they have a lot of work to do in fixing the current Qoocam 3 before they move on to the Ultra. Something tells me though it will be the exact same story as this video, just with a different camera with different specs. So that's my thoughts on the Qoocam 3. Let me know if you have any questions down below. I'll do my best to answer. And now it's time for my biased thoughts on the Qoocam 3 and Kandao in general, because I've tried not to be biased up until this point. I don't know if I was successful or not, but I have a pretty unique perspective that I feel like I have to share in this video. And that is around the question of whether you can trust Kandao. Now, I pride myself on honesty and authenticity with my audience. If something's a red flag, I will always say it's a red flag, even if I have good relationships or even paid sponsored relationships with camera brands. So if something's an issue, I'm always going to tell you, and I'm not going to not mention it like many other reviewers do, in order to maintain their relationships with the camera companies. So back in 2020, I sent an email to my email list with my honest thoughts on the Qoocam 8K. And in it, I talked about the reliability factor, how that is something that I find personally really important when you're shooting professional virtual tours. I talked about that sometimes, despite cameras having inferior specs, if they've got a high reliability factor, that can be more important than high specs if the camera is unpredictable. And that with the thermal defocus issue of the Qoocam 8K, this made the camera unpredictable, because if you're shooting with it, your shots go out of focus, you're in front of paid clients, that's a boo-boo. So I sent this to my email list, and the next day I got an email from Kandao saying that they saw my email and that they were terminating all communications with me. Because normally you have an ongoing relationship where you actually talk to them, you try to find out about cameras so you can best present them to your audience. Kandao said that they were terminating our relationship because of the email I sent. Instead of actually reading it and listening and learning and implementing, they basically said, "You're dead to me." And I get that. Nobody likes receiving negative feedback, and it can be hard to take sometimes, but it's for the greater good, and ultimately for the greater good of their paid customer base. So from that day forth, they never talked to me ever again, and come their latest release of their new camera, They acted like I didn't exist. They sent the camera to every other reviewer, including micro influencers with like 1,000 followers or less. They sent them out. And then we got a wave of reviews that were seemingly all like okay-ish to decent to good, but none pointing out the serious red flag that I mentioned in this video. I'm not trying to point any fingers, but I do think there's a lot of people out there that prioritize their relationship with the camera brands over speaking the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Which is why I want you to treat every other review of the Qoocam 3 with extreme skepticism, which you can do to my video as well, please do. But when camera companies try and control the narrative around their product, to me that crosses a tricky ethical line that probably shouldn't be crossed. Whereas companies like Insta360, if someone says something bad about their products, even if that reviewer was wrong or biased or whatever, Insta360 doesn't treat them like that. They'll still maintain a line of communication with them because it's in the best interests of their user base to hear a wide range of perspectives. And aside from me being excommunicated, I'm actually okay with that. I'm fine. I live to tell the tale. The bigger issue I have is that certain paid customers that bought the Qoocam 8K few years ago that were mentioning these issues in the Kandao Facebook group had their posts deleted and they were blocked from the group because they were voicing negative opinions. That's where I draw the line. And that's why I don't personally trust Kandao. Yes, they make a decent enough camera for virtual tours, but in terms of them trying to control their own narrative, they're doing it in the wrong way. I could keep going and going, but I won't. I've wanted to say this for some time, so I appreciate you hanging around to listen. And if you want to get a heads up from me about future 360 cameras just like that email and other valuable exclusive email content, then you can subscribe to my email newsletter, which I'll link below. So what are your thoughts on the Qoocam 3 and everything I mentioned in this video? Let me know down below. Now that's a hard act to follow, but if you want more from me, more 360 photo or video tutorials, advice, check out this video here. You can watch another quality Mr. Ben video. Peace out.